he's made a terrible mistake with the war in Ukraine,
Yes.
first in thinking it up and then in how it's been executed. And his grip on power is really shaky. And I think the best evidence of this was the readiness of the people of Rostov to cheer the Wagnerites. And remember, this Prigozhin is a nutty fascist gangster straight out of The Sopranos. And the idea that the people of Rostov were ready to go and cheer for him and his bunch of jailbird, bloodthirsty riffraff shows how weak Putin's grip on the public sentiment really is.
That's Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary. Now, let's first welcome Ed Lucas, Times columnist and Senior Vice President at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Welcome to you, Ed.
Hello, John.
Good to have you. Good to have you here. It is remarkable, isn't it, among so many remarkable facets of this story, how we all seem to be flailing in the dark to understand just what happened on Saturday. From the theories go from the collapse of Putin being imminent, the Kremlin falling, to an elaborate cunning plot to flush out enemies at home and in Ukraine.
Yes, I think that we could possibly trace this back to the last 30 years of getting Russia wrong, where we misunderstood what happened in 1991 and have systematically underestimated the complexity and the danger of what's going on in Russia. And we don't, at this stage, I think, at least in the public domain, have enough facts to really know what happened. Chiefly, why did Prigozhin turn back, which is the big mystery. And his latest 11-minute rant, which I've just been listening to, doesn't really explain that. I think there's also big questions about Putin's future. He's clearly weakened, and although Prigozhin's challenge to him may have failed, there will be others. And I think we're counting Putin's time in power now in months at the most, and possibly weeks or even days.
Really, that is a huge statement to make. I mean, we can't be confident about anything yet, but interesting to hear you say there is such clear and present danger to Putin. Were that to be the case, if we do look at a collapse of Putin and his Kremlin order, we've no idea where that could lead. It could produce something even uglier, even more dangerous than what we see at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think that there's been a stunning lack of thinking and preparation in this country and in many West European allies for what a post-Putin Russia will be like. This contrasts sharply with places like Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, which have been thinking about it very deeply. I think that it's possible we get a palace coup and a fairly sort of neat transition with Putin getting a unexpected bout of ill health, followed by a retirement and one of his hench people taking over. But I think that the more likely medium-term prospect is what in Russian is called a smutное время, a time of troubles, of disorder. And that's going to be very difficult indeed to deal with, and something we're not at all prepared for.
I mean, given that it's difficult to understand what happened yesterday and the day before, let alone tomorrow and the day after, when you contemplate maybe the imminent collapse of Vladimir Putin, how does that scenario look to you in your mind, however foggy?
I suppose that there are two broad scenarios. One is what you might call the tap on the shoulder, and the other is what you might call shots in the courtyard. And so that would depend whether the people around Putin say, look, boss, you're really not up to it these days. And if we don't shunt you aside gracefully, there's going to be something much nastier happening. Or it may be that we get some more sort of radical transfer of power. And I'm very cautious about speculating about that. It's a bit like saying, where's the boiler going to burst?
Yes.
And we can see that the boiler has got too much pressure in it. It's not designed for this. And the things are only going to get worse, not better. But where the actual disaster happens, for at least for the Putin regime, is, I think, it's difficult to speculate. But I do think that our view of Putin is very out of date. For the last 20 years, we've had this idea that Putin is either centre stage or backstage, holding the reins, and is a popular, strong, effective, competent ruler. And that just isn't the case. He's made a terrible mistake with the war in Ukraine, first in thinking it up and then in how it's been executed. And his grip on power is really shaky. And I think the best evidence of this was the readiness of the people of Rostov to cheer the Wagnerites. And remember, this Prigozhin is a nutty fascist gangster straight out of The Sopranos. And the idea that the people of Rostov were ready to go and cheer for him and his bunch of jailbird, bloodthirsty riffraff shows how weak Putin's grip on the public sentiment really is.
I have to say, Ed, I am slightly catching my breath at what I'm listening to from you. You are a commentator and analyst that I respect enormously, and you seem to be taking have come to the conclusion that that Putin's time is up. It's now just a matter of time, and the only question is how much time. And it may not be very much at all.
Well, I mean, nobody lives forever, so old Father Time always has the last word.
Sure.
And so I think everybody accepts Putin won't be in power indefinitely. The next sort of big benchmark for him is the presidential election, which is due next year.
Oh.
And even in Russia's rigged political system, you need a certain amount of public support to do that with credibility, and I think that's ebbing. But I wrote a piece back in January saying that Russia's civil war has actually already started, pointing to the mushrooming growth of these private military companies, and quoting a very impressive Russian analyst called Andrei Piontkovsky, who's right far more often than he's wrong. And nothing that's happened since then has made me think I'm wrong on that. So there's a huge lump of blame floating around Russia like ball lightning, looking for somewhere to land, which is blame for the disastrous war. And although Putin is the best protected person in Russia, he's also in a way the most vulnerable because he is the ultimate scapegoat.
Ed, it's really great to talk to you. Ed Lucas there, thank you. Now, I want to welcome to the show Gabriel Gavin, who's a correspondent from Politico, who covers Russia and, of course, covered the former Soviet Union. Gabriel, hi.
Hi.
So just get us up to date with the story so far, just today, because we've heard, haven't we, from Prigozhin and from Putin.
Yeah, well, we heard from Prigozhin just a few moments ago, and he launched into one of his kind of characteristic tirades, uploaded to his Telegram channel, in which he basically doubled down on the reasons for his rebellion. He kind of insisted that it wasn't about trying to evict Putin from the Kremlin. He insisted it's about just trying to protect Wagner from the kind of quote-unquote incompetent Moscow military top brass. And at the same time, there's a particularly interesting allusion in there that he says the reason they stood down, part of the deal that meant that his men didn't march on Moscow, was a promise from Belarusian autocrat Alexander Lukashenko that Belarus would help Wagner continue working within the bounds of Belarusian law. So effectively, we might see that Prigozhin and his men aren't so much exiled as rehomed. And obviously, there's a question. He's tried to overthrow one Eastern European president this week already. Whether Lukashenko can kind of keep a leash on the dog it remains to be seen.
Yeah, but that suggests that what was really driving Prigozhin was the desire to wage war his own way with his own people, rather than turf out the high command of the Russian military.
Well, I think what drives men like Prigozhin is usually power, and when that comes to the battlefield, that means being able to do what you want when you want without having to answer to people like Sergei Shoigu, who he clearly considers as the Minister of Defense to be incompetent. But I think when someone with those motivations is on the cusp of marching on the capital, there's absolutely no telling where his lust for power will take him.
Yeah.
It's very, very unclear as to whether he would effectively turn up with tanks and artillery in the streets of Moscow and then just ask for the resignation of two senior military officials. I think his promise to the country to win, to have victory, it opens the door up to him basically having had a much larger role. Right. But it's clear he didn't have the stones to deliver on that.
Yeah, extraordinary story. What is your judgment, Gabriel, on Putin himself? Talking to Ed Lucas, who, as you know, knows a lot of what he's talking about on this subject. His view was that the facade of Putin's omnipotence has now been shattered. And for Ed, effectively politically, Vladimir Putin was now a dead leader walking. Is that your view?
Well, I think the great luxury of being Vladimir Putin is that you don't really have to worry about what very many people think. I completely take the point. He'll have to stand probably contest an election. I continue to remain convinced that Russians are a mixture of supportive and apathetic, and utterly disinterested in a lot of this war, and can't visualize a world without Putin still. And actually, I think while people like you and I have been glued to our screens over the weekend, watching every twist and turn of these events, a lot of ordinary Russians, even ones I've spoken to, were on the dacha with bad internet, not really following the news. They said, "Oh, Prigozhin's a good guy," and then they said, "Oh, he's a traitor," and then they carried on with their lives. If and when it comes time for Putin to kind of be ushered out stage left, it'll be a very small group of people indeed who make that decision, and at least one of them will have to be holding a pistol.
Right, Gabriel Gavin, good to talk to you too. Thank you, Gabriel Gavin there from Politico.